listening to the Check 6 podcast, brought to you by editors from across the Aviation Week network. Listeners now have access to special subscription offers, including 30% off Aviation Week and Space Technology. Go to podcast.aviationweek.com to learn more.
Hi, and welcome to Check 6, Aviation Week's podcast. I'm Pentagon editor Laura Seligman. Joining me is Billy Flynn, Lockheed Martin test pilot who flew the F-35A in its premier aerobatic demonstration at the Paris Air Show this summer. So, Billy, you were a fighter pilot and a squadron commander with the Royal Canadian Air Force, I believe. So tell me a bit about your background and how you came to work for Lockheed Martin.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. It's fun to talk about the F-35. And a great opportunity to talk about what we're doing in the program, what I've been doing. So 30 seconds on my background. It was a career in the Canadian Armed Forces, the first baby F-18 pilot in Canada, through to being a commander in combat in Aviano, Italy, flying up over Kosovo and Serbia as part of Operation Allied Force. In that time frame, somewhere in there, I went to test pilot school. I flew F-16s on exchange at Edwards Air Force Base for nearly 5 years. And then after my career ended, I flew the Eurofighter Typhoon in Germany for 4 years, early on in its lifetime, and then finally got hired by Lockheed Martin in early 2000s to come back and fly F-16s, primarily Block 60, which is the F-16 we built for the United Arab Emirates. It's relevant because it's a very capable, very lethal F-16 fourth-gen fighter that leads into now years around F-35, lucky enough now to be flying F-35s at Pax River with the Navy and Marine Corps pilots that are there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that must have been really exciting. So tell me about your years flying the F-16 as a test pilot.
I think the F-16 is relevant for a couple of reasons. First point is to say it's the quintessential fourth-gen fighter. And in layman's terms, it's the sexiest, coolest fighter jet ever made, and everyone that's ever flown it has thought, I'm sure, the same thing. But there's some things that are interesting about it. I flew the F-16 as a test pilot 25 years after its first flight, and we were really, really busy even the 2.5 decades after it first started, which tells us, as we look into F-35 land and 10 years after first flight of F-35, that we have decades of work to do as test pilots and engineers, enhancing the product, bringing in new innovations, making the airplane better, more survivable, more lethal. The second part of it is, I think what's interesting is that it was a different world in the F-16. Fourth generation fighters, all that are out there now, are mostly about flight sciences. Mm-hmm. It's so much about the kinematics of the airplane, how it flies, contributes to whether it's lethal and survivable and capable. We look at now at fifth-gen fighters, and it's not about how our airplane flies. It's about what we can do. Mm-hmm. The final point I would say about back then is I worked at Edwards Air Force Base. It's Mecca for test pilots, learning your skill, but also for leading-edge technology development. It's the land of the right stuff. Oh, by the way, Chuck Yeager was played by Sam Shepard, recently deceased. We all love that movie. That's a place where you push the boundaries of everything. In my time, I participated in thrust vectoring development on the F-16, a research program, but also because of that, got to fly the NASA thrust vector into F-18 called the High Alpha Research Vehicle. And I fought in an F-18 against the X-31, which was an experimental NASA thrust vector airplane. So even back then, pushing technologies that we still talk about today. That's
so
part of the experience.
You fought against the X-31?
I was an F-18. I had been an F-18 pilot, so I flew, I think, 2 flights as an adversary against the X-31, which dominated in its day. And it's relevant now because we're talking about thrust vectoring, even on airplanes, not necessarily in the Western world right now. And so we had looks at these technologies decades before they've been introduced in other platforms. So that's the Edwards experience. Mecca, 25 years into its lifetime, tells us that we have a long way to go in the lifetime of testing of of F-35.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is really, really interesting. And just seeing the F-35 fly at Paris, even though it doesn't have the thrust vectoring that, say, the F-22 does, it was pretty impressive how powerful that engine was and how much you were able to actually control the jet.
So we can talk, I would talk for days about the demo and what we tried to do. There's some fascinating parts of that. One is the choreography of a show that is limited to 6 minutes. Second part is why we built the show the way we did in terms of what we understood. And finally, how complex it was to develop that routine, how many people it took as part of the big teamwork to get to that. So why don't we get into that just for fun? The choreography, I came to dispel the myths. I built a program knowing I'd flown to Paris, by the way, 30 years before in the F-18, and I knew you had 6 minutes with pretty significant restrictions on altitudes and distances, boundaries around the airplane, lots of rules that confined what you could do, and you have 6 minutes. And whatever your wow factor is, that's the time limit you have. So you have to build, in my case, a program to dispel the myths, to use your words, crush all the misinformation about what the F-35 can do, and then make that airplane a global billboard for what this 5th gen program is all about. And we had to create a program that was easy to understand for everybody out there, for kids, to the public, to the nations that are considering buying it. And there had to be some demonstration that made it really apparent what this airplane was all about, and then allow us to change the conversation and talk about what we really want to do, which is not just how the aircraft flies, but what it can do in terms of lethality, survivability, interoperability, coalition warfare. So that's the choreography element of that. There's a experience part that helps us build that program. So I'd flown there 30 years before. As a demo pilot, you have a pretty good idea what your audience wants to see. And it's not necessarily what pilots think they want to show. It's what the audience is supposed to see from you. It's not always easy as pilots. You want to fly the coolest, most dynamic program, but that might not be what you want everybody on the ground to see. So I structured a program based on 3 elements. I wanted to show 5th gen superiority. So I grant that the F-22 has thrust vectoring and is stunning when it flies, but we have fabulous flight control systems that allow us to pull off 50 degrees angle of attack and maneuverability, yaw rates commanded as much as 50 degrees per second, and slow speed maneuverability that is really, really impressive. So 5th gen superiority, the highlights of what an F-16 could do, which is raw brute power. So that's a 2,000 foot takeoff, in my case, immediately rotating to a vertical climb. Or it's a slow speed pass, lighting the afterburner and pulling straight up. That's kind of F-16 power. And then I had come from a Hornet background where as a demo pilot, I did square loops and really impressive slow speed passes. It's what that airplane was particularly good at. And so I thought it was germane. I thought it was important to show that we are also fabulous in the slow speed environment. So those 3 elements, and put those together in 6 minutes. Make it wow factor, show everybody what you wanted to see, get the conversation back to what the F-35 is all about, and crush the myths once and for all. No one is ever, let's put this out there, no one's ever talking to us again about losing in a dogfight to a 40-year-old F-16 tanked F-16. That conversation is over forever, and I thought it was appropriate that we did that. It is important, third part of this, to make it clear that I'm just the lucky guy who got to fly. The poorest secret in Lockheed Martin the past year has been my demo, because so many engineers have been involved, graphic artists to help illustrate what we were going to do, animators to do the animations of what this was going to look like, the pilots that would look over my shoulder and watch me looking at videos every day. Everyone knew this was coming. It's a massive team effort to have built it. It's a pretty complex airplane. We had to do this safely, It had to be predictable. It had to be repeatable. And the team that supported all that over really a year was really significant. And then when it came to flying, so I started flying after Paris was announced, and we rapidly jumped into this. I practiced for 3 weeks to get my routine down, and had a fabulous team from the United States Air Force, from Hill Air Force Base, 388th Fighter Wing, a ground crew that were there every day to make sure the airplanes were up and ready to practice. Ground crew that came from Texas with me over to Paris, and then plussed up with extra folks. They were they gave a stunning effort, really the best of the pointy end of the United States Air Force. Without the support of the United States Air Force, DOD, all of that, we would never have been able to pull this off. It's a massive team effort. I was just the luckiest guy to be the one lighting the afterburner every day, but all the credit goes to the USAF for their support and our engineers that were flawless. We wouldn't have been able to pull off the miracles that I thought it took to get us to fly on that first day that you talked about in your article. I thought that's because the whole team came together.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for the demo phase portion of this? You said before when we were talking that the Bs and the Cs, you're working on demos for those as well.
So Paris is unique. It's a time limit. It's heavily structured in terms of minimum altitudes, boundaries around. There's a town across from the ramp. Mm-hmm. So you watched it on the airshow side. On the other side of that runway is a town and with altitude restrictions that bounded how low we could fly. Mm-hmm. You can't go too far north or south of the runway. You can't go too high. If you take away those restrictions, then I get to fly 1,000 or 1,500 feet lower. The crowd gets to see the airplane without looking way up in the sky. I get to fly with a lower cloud base. I get to fly longer to demonstrate what the airplane can do, and this routine becomes what it really could. Because there's lots more of what the F-35 is all about. Mm-hmm. That we think is worth showing. Clearly, those who saw the B model in Fairford and Farnborough a year and a half ago would be impressed to see how the aircraft flies up and away, besides just the STOVL element at the end of that. And so developing those routines and having those ready for the next show is important, and that's clearly what I've been working on since Paris. Paris was important. It was a trump card I thought we needed to play. Mm-hmm. With the brilliant support from everyone, and I think the payoff was massive because 10 years in, I think it was time to show in a visual sense what the airplane is all about. It allows us to, again, change the conversation. So now that you believe the aircraft is dominant, it's powerful, it's, as the French would say, méchant. Méchant means nasty or wicked. That's what they call the airplane. Now that you believe the airplane is nasty and wicked, we're going to be able to talk about sensor fusion and stealth and the other highlights of what this airplane's all about. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to do more demos because we've proven what the investment was in terms of its worth for us. I think people at home, so it's domestically, have a right to see what the airplane's capable. We, the American taxpayer, support this airplane. We understand for the three services, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy, that it's the future. It's 40 years of replacing those legacy platforms, and people have a right to see what the airplane's capable of, so they don't just have to listen to you and I, they'll actually believe for their own eyes. Seeing is believing. And then overseas, because of the cultural differences in every country, our messaging is different than here in America. I came from Canada. I grew up in Canada. We don't talk about platforms the same way in Canada as we do in the States, and certainly not the case in Europe. And so letting folks see the airplane for their own eyes and letting them understand how it will contribute in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Denmark, hopefully in Belgium, or in Italy, helps them understand how it has a place and how sovereignty protection and coalition warfare is done in those nations, because it's done differently than how the United States Air Force would use it.
So do you have future demonstrations on the books yet?
I think we have a roadmap ahead. I wish I knew all of it, but my job is to be ready to go, to have the engineers behind us. It really is a complex effort to get this show ready. Mm-hmm. And so the people that support me are ready for the next one. So my job's different. Contractor, whether you fly for Eurofighter or you fly for Lockheed Martin or you fly for Boeing or for Saab, our job is to demonstrate the product. And that's different than in the military when we did flying displays. So I was a military demo pilot. Our job was to put on a great display, fly a good airplane, but also to recruit, help people understand what the military service, the Air Force, was all about. That's not what we do. We being a Lockheed demo pilot. My job is to do a performance demonstration. And every maneuver is effectively an engineering demonstration of power, of response, of agility, of angle of attack capability, of yaw rates. It's not there to wow the crowd. It's to show how good this particular airplane is in a particular environment. So our focus is a little different, and mine's very much an engineering-driven demonstration.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's back up a little bit and talk about the broader F-35 program. Just tell me maybe some of the key technologies that you've been involved in testing and some of notable moments maybe in the last couple of years testing this aircraft.
So let's talk about why this is different than, say, flying an F-16 20-something years ago.
Yeah.
It is the most complex. It is the biggest program by orders of magnitude than anything any of us ever touched. As test pilots, from young to old, from inexperienced to experienced, we all approach this airplane like it's the graduation ceremony as a test pilot. Everyone's watching all the time. It's a product of the age, or our world's a product of the age of iPhones and Blackberries and instant messaging. Everything we do has massive oversight for lots of good reasons. So we're much more structured in how we fly. We attempt to be much more efficient when we fly. Our jobs are much more complex than they ever were when I was a young test pilot. So how we do it is so different than my experience on F-16s and on Typhoon. What's notable about this airplane is not just how it flies, it's what it can do. We accept now, in 2017, that we better build an airplane that's the easiest airplane to fly that any of us have ever touched, from takeoff to landing to how it maneuvers. I think most people that fly the F-35 would agree that that's the case, because it's not about the airplane, right? It is about what we do. What is sensor fusion? What does it mean to meld the inputs from electro-optical sensors and our radar and our electronic warfare suite and present it on a single simple display in front of the pilot? What does that mean? Because that's not the same display that was in the Typhoon, the F-16, or the F-18s that I grew up in. That's colossally difficult to do. And that's, in a big scale, that's the difference of it. Having said all that, what makes me believe so much in the program is not that I work for Lockheed, it's that I've seen the difference in how hard we work at this. So we do have lots of oversight. It means that we can't quit on the tough technologies. And my favorite example is the helmet. So the helmet had a pretty public start when everyone watched it, and it wasn't flawless in the beginning. We had jitter, we had latency, and lots of people, including AvWeek, spent lots of time reporting on it. The success story is how we worked past that. So I call it the courage of engineering. From the government side, the engineers and the pilots on the government side, to the Lockheed engineers, pilots, and scientists, we figured out how to make this work, how to overcome the hurdles and make the helmet become the success that the nearly 500 pilots that have flown F-35 all believe in. Every man and woman that's touched this airplane believes in the helmet, and the success of that is because we would not or could not give up. That's so different than early F-16, early F-18, or Typhoon examples that I have, where when the technologies got hard, we just walked away. And an F-35, for a host of reasons, we can't do that. It's why I have so much more faith in how the airplane will evolve and what its success will be, because we just can't afford to let go of the hard stuff. So the helmet to me is just a brilliant example of making it work.
Yeah. And what are you working on primarily right now in terms of testing?
every one of us is pretty focused, or we're clearly focused on the end of SDD, System Design and Development, essentially the end of the calendar year of this year. We're 10 and a half years since first flight. It's time to close this phase out, and we are sharply focused on finishing the flight science testing, so the airframe, the weapons we carry, what the airplane can do, all the bits of that, STOVL testing, all the nooks and crannies of the envelope, so that we've covered every part of that conversation. On the boat, making sure that we have every part of the behavior of the airplane in that environment done. And then the hardest part is the mission systems. So really elaborate evaluations of all the complex sensors that we have told everybody will work. We have to make those work so that this airplane's as least lethal as we said it would be. And when we're done that, then we have a lifetime of work of enhancements. So the answer to your question, the end of STD, and no one's taking our eye off the ball till we're done that. Mm-hmm. We love how this airplane flies. We know it's dramatically more lethal than any fourth generation fighter that any of us came from, but it's making sure it does exactly what we said to do. It's not an easy task.
Mm-hmm. On the fusion side, that's something that's been reported on a lot over the last couple of years. You know, it's something that's really taking this technology to a new place than any other aircraft has gone before. So can you talk about testing of the fusion and how that's gone and how that's improved over the last couple of years?
Can I talk first about how hard it has been for us to communicate that conversation?
Yes.
You had Dave Burke in here a couple weeks ago in a debate, and he said it, I think, correctly, that we've not done a great job of articulating what these technologies are meant to do, because it comes up time and time again. It's hard for people to understand. Mm-hmm. What does it mean, in this case, sensor fusion? What does it mean to see some screen in front of you? Even our simulators don't help that. We have to get better at telling everyone, not selling it, but telling everybody what these technologies are meant to do. It's just really hard. It's rocket science, and it's hard for us to explain that in proper technical terms or even layman's terms. Mm-hmm. So sensor fusion's difficult. It started with F-22. It is not like any other manufacturer's done. Let's be clear, you can label anything else, but unless you're Dr. Tom Fry, who is essentially the key pin to this, you don't have sensor fusion, you have correlation. Started with F-22, and I think because our sensor suite is different in F-35, it's different, not better, just different. And you have to take the information from all these sensors, make sure that we know the difference between one object that we're looking at and the next, and put it up on a screen for the pilot, so that he's looking at a single screen and not 4 displays like in the legacy airplanes we're used to, where you would get overloaded. We have to put it on a single display, make it simple enough that everybody can understand it every time, and not make mistakes, and not have false targets, and have the clarity and the confidence in the identifications or the sources, so that we know it's really truth data. That's phenomenally hard to get that kind of fidelity, and we tax it enormously in our evaluations, even in developmental testing. That's what we are in right now. When it gets to operational testing, and we let those pilots loose with it, they'll even push it further and harder to help us enhance it. Most of us that see fusion love what we see now, but we know it has to do so much more, and it opens our eyes. We get to see how capable the airplane is, so we want more. Look how good we are. The product, after watching the display at red flag and a better than 20-to-1 kill ratio, you start to have some confidence that this airplane's doing some things that we never thought it could before. That doesn't mean we can't stop, that we're able to stop. One of the fun things, let's go back to, if we can, thrust vectoring. Because it's interesting that here we are 20-something years later, and we're talking about technologies that are flying on some airplanes that we looked at in the Western world 2.5 decades ago. So my first Av Week moment is on the cover on the 2nd of May, 1994, in the F-16 multi-axis thrust vectoring airplane doing a Cobra maneuver with smoke winders on the airplane in the middle of a Cobra maneuver, and that's the cover shot. 23 years ago, we flew thrust vectoring on an F-16 in a nozzle that was called an axisymmetric vector exhaust nozzle. Basically meant the engine could move all around. And at the same time, we were testing thrust vectoring on the X-31 at NASA and the NASA F-18 HARV, High Alpha Research Vehicle. And we looked at thrust vectoring way back when. It made its way onto the F-22, and it didn't make its way onto the F-35, which is interesting. It didn't earn its way. We are fortunate enough to have a flight control system that's so capable that I don't know that thrust vectoring would have helped that much.
So the flight control system is so good, and you don't really necessarily need the thrust vectoring. Is that what you're saying?
We don't need what thrust vectoring would have done. So thrust vectoring is a complex conversation. So let's break that down just for a second, and let's come back to say why I don't know that we would need it in F-35. But part of the sales story back in the early 90s for the NASA group that I worked with and our program was that it was going to save lives because it was going to help prevent out-of-control events. In a 20-year span, the F-14, F-15, F-16, and F-18 fleet had hundreds of aircraft go out of control for a host of reasons, which include flight control failures and hydraulic failures and engine failures and aggressive maneuvering. And a host of pilots died in those events. And thrust vectoring was going to give these airplanes the control power to stay under control, to not lose control and not crash. That really was the compelling part of that story. We demonstrated and got everyone's attention doing basic fighter maneuvers in the X-31 and in our MATV, letting people come see what the airplane could do and let them fly. But that wasn't how the technology was going to earn its way onto airplanes. It was going to be for safety.
That's interesting.
And so now I look at an F-35 that's really difficult to get out of control. To get back in control is the easiest of all the airplanes we've flown. And I don't see the same rationale that would be useful in an F-35 case. I get to pull the 50 Alpha. I get to command yaw rates that nobody else can match. I don't know that you would buy much more on if you put thrust vectoring on.
Yeah, that's interesting. The safety piece of that leads us into the auto GCAS discussion that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
And that's something that you've also had experience with testing.
So if there's two technologies in my lifetime that I was lucky to be a part of was thrust vectoring, fascinating at the time, leading edge, and then auto GCAS. And I was part of the team that developed the automatic ground collision avoidance system at Edwards Air Force Base in an Air Force leased 2-seat F-16. Guy Norris got to fly in it to see what the technology is about. And we developed the 98% solution to prevent ground impact in a research program led by the Lockheed, we know it as the Skunk Works Advanced Development Programs team. And they're really central to the whole conversation as we go forward, and that's why I mentioned it. And we developed a program that was in an F-16 that was flawless. It's relatively simple to understand, courtesy of the evolution of technologies. You can do a bunch of it, as NASA did on a smartphone, and control a drone, just to be clear.
Wow.
What is it? It's Google Earth, we all have. It's a GPS, which we all have on our phones now. And it's a link to the flight control system, in our case through an autopilot, that lets us control the airplane. And then it has a relatively simple algorithm that takes control of the airplane and flies it away from Google Earth when it sees that ground impact is going to happen. And the sophistication of our technologies now are such that Google Earth is really precise. GPS we all have, and we're smart enough to figure out how to break into the flight control system. I'll get to the essential part of this, because in 2009 to 2011 we developed these technologies, and then it was released to the F-16 fleet. They tested it at Edwards Air Force Base, and it's now in much of the F-16 fleet. 4 confirmed saves, and recently 2 events that are under analysis potentially are 2 more saves. So that's 4 pilots that are alive. That's 4 airframes that we don't have to go buy again. And so the payoff is incalculable when we talk about the lives that we've already saved with this technology. It's the most important contribution to flight safety in 40 years. There is not a soul now that does not believe that the investment in auto GCAS is worth every penny, every bit of effort. And I know that in F-35, if you ask me the one thing that I want to see as soon as possible, it's auto GCAS. It's in getting it in however we can, as quick as we can, because we know from our F-16 example already that we are going to save lives. A lesser form or a different form of auto GCAS exists in F-22, but if we could put it in the F-35 right now, we would. And as time goes on, so when we look ahead decades, you'll see auto GCAS in commercial airplanes. You'll see them in corporate jets. There's no way that we want to be, and there's no excuse for us flying into the ground anymore for any of the reasons that have haunted us in the past, when the technology is pretty simple to understand, pretty sophisticated, and pretty easy to implement.
But the F-35 does have some form of auto landings, even on carriers. Like when I went out to see the F-35 developmental trials on the carrier, I saw the F-35C would come down and hit the deck at the exact same place every time.
So two parts. We have manual ground collision avoidance in the F-35. It is linked to this automatic version I talked about, so it's the same technologies, and that gives us the warning that we would hit a mountain, we would fly into the ground. So we have the building blocks to make it an automatic system. Our landing capabilities, especially with the carrier variant, are really sophisticated. Delta flight path, as it is known, makes the enormously difficult task of landing on the big boat dramatically easier than ever before. We will reduce training times where Navy pilots have to work hard to practice to do that. We'll scrub those down significantly, and we'll make pilots that much more safer getting back on the boat, especially with emergencies as time goes on. The evidence that you saw from DT2 that you wrote is a stunning set of statistics about how accurate, how sophisticated, how precise Delta path is. Delta flight path, Delta path. The Super Hornet fleet has looked at it, and it's working its way through that too. Landing on the boat consumes a lot of time for naval aviators, and making that task easier is hugely important. That's what Delta flight path does for them.
But that's not the full auto GCAS.
No, auto GCAS will be preventing accidents like in the F-22 fatality, from spatial disorientation, from whatever the reason is that sent an airplane close to the ground where the pilot was not always in control. The statistics are so disheartening, so heartbreaking over so many years in everybody's fleet, that everything that we can do to put auto GCAS into fighter jets first, we have to do.
Yeah, that was a really sad situation, Captain Haney, right? Where he tried to pull up at the very last second.
Well, I've experienced them early in the F-18. I was on the very first course in Canada. One of my classmates died hitting the tundra in Cold Lake, Alberta at 700 knots because he was busy looking at screens inside the cockpit. 5 minutes before that, another classmate had missed the ground by less than 100 feet, pulling 11.8 G, trying to miss the 11.8 G, by the way, trying to miss the ground because guys were too busy with workload. And I came from an Air Force that had significant number of accidents, especially in the F-18 fleet, from spatial disorientation or some form of controlled flight into terrain. It's time to stop all of that conversation, and that's what auto GCAS promises to do. That's the reward of the research program that I got to be a part of in 2009 to 2011.
So is there a timeline for the F-35 to get auto GCAS?
I don't know that we all know that people are looking at it aggressively. Our teams are, because the F-16 stories help bolster our confidence in what this technology is. The effort by journalists like Avweek to talk about what the saves meant helps make everybody understand how compelling this technology is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about weapons testing as well, the kind of weapons testing on the F-35 you're doing as part of SDD and then the follow-on program. So can you just talk about that?
So in fact, last week I finished the last of JDAM testing on the C model, as an example. Part of our efforts to close things out for the end of SDD. And we still have weapons deliveries to do as part of our effort that goes on through Christmas this year, because we're all optimistic we will be done. The bigger conversation on F-35 is that we in the Western world, with with two fabulous 5th gen platforms, have legacy weapons for us to carry. So our 5th gen platforms are carrying 4th gen weapons.
Right.
And we all know that what we want is to match a 5th gen capability for our weapons and not put our pilots, men and women, so close to an adversary, so deep in enemy territory, because our weapons don't have the range or the precision that we ultimately want. And all our efforts as we go forward, we're talking SDB 1 and 2, but our weapons development to make them as capable as our airframe is really important. 4th gen airplanes can't go into enemy territory and heavily defended territory right now unless we have massive packages to protect the bombers or the attackers, right? That's jammers, that's sweep airplanes, that's suppression of enemy air defense assets, that's AWACS to control the big monster guerrilla packages that we send, different than even our worse off than our 5th gen airplanes who are necessarily autonomous, but all of us are going far too deep in enemy territory to deliver the weapons we have. And we need to create the standoff that keeps our assets away from really lethal surface-to-air capabilities on the adversary side. And weapons will be a big push as we get into follow-on modernization and enhancing the capability of the airplane.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for you after SDD?
Well, so follow-on modernization and how we put together the plan to go forward. Where does this airplane go? It's in Iwakuni now. It's deployed as an operational squadron at Hill Air Force Base. Those guys have already been in Europe. We're talking about airplanes now that are flown in 12 separate bases, and in Israel. What do we do as the fleet gets out there? We have over 100,000 flight hours now.
That's right.
Nearly 500 pilots trained, and our line to accelerate this program is not linear. It ramps up aggressively, and every year there's that many more airplanes out there now to be used soon operationally, or is operationally, but by even more forces. We need to enhance what the airplane can do in the hands of the operators, not just testers. And they'll discover more capabilities that they want, and we have to be as agile, as aggressive as we can to implement those technologies as they come in. I don't think we all know them. We know from, the F-16 evolved to an airplane that we never imagined it would be over its years. The F-18 that I flew for most of my career, at the end of its days, is nothing like the airplane it started out to be.
Right.
We know that this multi-role platform has a lot to do. What are we going to do with ISR capabilities? What about the nations that never had a SEED or DEED capability, so suppression of enemy air defense capability? Think of the far north. What are we going to do in Alaska with F-35s? In Denmark, for the Danes in Greenland? What are we going to do for the Norwegians in the far north? Potentially Finland? How do we protect the Arctic? How do we run network-centric operations? How do we use the reconnaissance and intelligence capability of that airplane platform? How do we evolve that? There's a lot to go here. We're just touching the beginning of what this airplane's all about, or what it can do.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting program to cover, and I'm sure it's a really interesting program to be a part of for you as well.
I think that, so let's come back to the demo, because that's how you and I got talking about this. I think that was a real confidence boost for everyone that is part of the program, everyone that flies the program, and everyone that is invested in the program. We got to see that the airplane kinematically was so much better than what they thought. And that gives us the confidence to believe that the airplane itself, what it has on the inside, is much better than folks were believed or were led to believe. And with all that confidence now, it's time to go ahead and unleash the airplane. Start believing that this is not a paper airplane, that it is for real, that the méchant airplane, the wicked airplane they saw in Paris is for real, and now it's time to get out there and get it out operational in all the different countries.
Absolutely. Well, that's about all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Again, I'm Lara Seligman. Thanks to all our listeners for listening. Join us next week on the Check 6 podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
Thanks.